in a kingdom carved from ivory and gold, where the sun always seemed to linger a second longer on the marble balconies, there lived a princess of such radiant beauty that the birds would stop their singing just to catch the reflection of her eyes in the garden ponds. Her name was Ilara, and her skin was the color of the first milk of dawn, while her hair flowed like a river of spun silk that reached the very tips of her velvet slippers. Every king and every knight, from the furthest reaches of the map, traveled through dust and storm just to catch a single glimpse of her smile. But Ilara remained as distant as the stars because her heart was waiting for a love that felt as deep as the roots of the world. Among the many who sought her hand was a prince named Valerius, who came from a land of jagged Obsidian Mountains, where the wind howled like a wounded wolf, and the iron gate never stayed open for long. He was known throughout the realms as the cruel Ashik Prince, because his love was not a soft light, but a burning fire that consumed everything in its path, and his eyes were like two pieces of cold flint that could spark a flame with a single glance. Valerius did not bring flowers or poems to the ivory palace, but instead he brought a silent and terrifying devotion that made the very air around him grow heavy with the weight of his obsession. He watched the princess from the shadows of the great hall, his jaw set like stone, and his heart beating with a fierce and hungry rhythm that refused to be silenced by her indifference. The cruelty of his love lay in its absolute nature, for he did not wish to share her with the world or the sun or the wind, but wanted to wrap her in a cloak of his own shadow, so that he would be the only light she ever knew. One evening, as the moon rose like a pale curved blade over the ivory towers, Valerius cornered the princess in the garden of white roses, where the scent of the petals was thick enough to drown in. He did not kneel or plead, but stood before her with the intensity of a storm cloud about to break, telling her that his love was a prison from which there was no escape, because he had already woven her name into the very fabric of his soul. The princess looked into his dark and turbulent eyes and felt a strange and heavy shiver crawl down her spine, for she realized that while other men loved her beauty, this prince loved the very ghost of her spirit with a passion that was as beautiful as it was dangerous. As the night deepened and the mist began to crawl over the garden floor, the cruel Ashik prince reached out a hand that was calloused from the sword and the reins, but his touch was surprisingly light. As he traced the line of her jaw, the ivory palace seemed to fade away into the distance, leaving only the two of them standing in a circle of moonlight, where the pain of his longing and the radiance of her beauty collided in the silence. Ilara felt the walls of her own heart beginning to crumble under the pressure of his unwavering gaze and the exhaustion of being a prize. For many finally gave way to the surrender of being the singular world for one. The cruelty of Valerius was not in his actions, but in the way his love demanded everything she was, and in the quiet of the midnight garden, she realized that she was no longer a princess of a kingdom, but the queen of a dark and lonely heart that would burn for her until the stars themselves went cold. The weight of his devotion settled over her like a heavy velvet blanket, pulling her to sleep where the only dreams were of iron mountains and obsidian skies, and the steady rhythmic pulse of a love that was too fierce to be kind. The beauty and the cruelty merged into a single shadow that drifted across the marble floors as the world outside vanished into a soft and seamless dark, where the prince and his princess were finally lost in the silence of their own making. The shadows in the garden grew longer and darker as the cruel Ashik prince led the princes away from the ivory towers and toward the edge of the world where the mountains touched the sky. Every step they took felt as though they were walking deeper into a dream made of silk and smoke, where the sounds of the palace were replaced by the low, steady breathing of the earth. Princess Alara felt the weight of his iron grip on her hand, but strangely, the pressure did not hurt it, felt like an anchor, holding her steady against the rising tide of the night. Valeris spoke no words as they climbed the hidden paths, but the intensity of his presence was a language of its own, a constant vibration that told her she was now the sun around which his entire dark universe rotated. The air turned cold and crisp as they reached the obsidian gates of his kingdom, where the walls were high and the windows were narrow like watching eyes. Inside his castle there were no golden lamps or soft tapestries, but instead the halls were lit by the flickering blue flames of dragon glass, and the floors were covered in the furs of great white bears. He led her to a chamber at the highest point of the tallest tower, where the bed was draped in midnight velvet, and the balcony looked out over a sea of clouds that glowed in the moonlight. The prince stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the stars, and he told her that here she would never have to be a princess for the world again, because she was now his secret and his soul. The cruelty in his voice had softened to a rough kind of worship as he watched her move through the room, her beauty casting a light that made the obsidian walls seem to weep with joy. He did not ask for her affection, but he demanded her presence with a ferocity that made her heart race and her eyes grow heavy with a strange and peaceful exhaustion. He brought her wine that tasted of crushed berries and mountain snow, and as she drank, the last of her resistance melted away into the shadows of the room. The mental pain of being a perfect porcelain doll in her father's escort was replaced by the heavy, visceral reality of being loved by a man who saw her as both a goddess and a ghost. As she lay down upon the velvet cushions, the prince sat at the foot of the bed, watching over her like a sentinel who would never sleep and whose only purpose was to guard the rhythm of her breath. The silence of the mountain kingdom was absolute, and it wrapped around the tower like a protective shell, keeping the chaos of the world far below. Elara felt herself sinking into the deep dark water of a sleep that felt more real than any waking moment she had ever known, because, for the first time, she was not being looked at. She was being seen. The cruel Ashik prince lowered his head and whispered a vow into the cold air, a promise that, as long as his heart beat with blood and fire, she would never know the cold of loneliness again. The darkness settled over them both as the moon completed its journey across the sky, and the ivory princess and her obsidian prince became two parts of a single shadow, lost in the vast and beautiful silence of the night. The days in the obsidian castle began to blend into a seamless ribbon of twilight, where the sun was merely a distant memory, and the only clock was the slow flickering of the blue flames against the stone walls. Princess Elara found that her world had shrunk to the size of the high tower and the shadow of the prince. But within that small space, she felt a vastness she had never known in the crowded halls of her father's palace. Valeris was a constant moon in her sky, always present and always watching with an intensity that felt like a physical weight upon her skin, making her every movement feel slow and deliberate, as if she were moving through deep water. He brought her gifts that were not made of gold or jewels, but of the mountain itself, a smooth stone shaped by 1,000 years of wind, a rare flower that bloomed only in the dark, and a cloak made of feathers from the eagles that circled the highest peaks. His cruelty was a strange kind of devotion that manifested in his refusal to let her eyes wander to the horizon, for he wanted her gaze to be fixed only on him until the rest of the world ceased to exist in her mind. He would sit for hours at the edge of her vision reading ancient poems of war and longing in a voice that sounded like the low rumble of a distant storm until the words became a part of her heartbeat. The princess realized that the mental pain of her former life, the hollow expectations, and the shallow praise had been replaced by a heavy and all-consuming fire that left no room for anything else. She was no longer a beautiful ornament, but the very center of a storm, and the exhaustion of being so fiercely claimed began to pull at her soul with a gentle but irresistible force. One night when the mountain wind was screaming against the obsidian walls, Valerius knelt beside her and placed his forehead against hers. And for the first time she saw a flicker of fear in his flint-like eyes. The fear of a man who had built a kingdom of shadows only to realize that he was nothing without the light she brought into it. He whispered that his cruelty was merely the armor he wore to protect a heart that had been broken by the cold, and that her beauty was the only warmth he had ever felt in a lifetime of winters. As he spoke, the walls of the tower seemed to lean in closer, and the blue flames dimmed to a soft glow, leaving them in a circle of intimate darkness where the only sound was the synchronized rhythm of their breathing. Ilara reached out and touched his face, finding the skin rough and scarred but warm. And she understood then that they were both prisoners of a love that was too large for the world to hold. The heaviness of the moment settled over her like a thick mist, turning her thoughts into soft echoes and her limbs into weightless branches swaying in a dark forest. She felt herself drifting away into a sleep that was deeper than the roots of the mountains. A sleep where the ivory palace and the obsidian castle vanished, and there was only the steady pulse of two souls tethered together in the void. The cruel Ashik prince stayed by her side, his hand resting lightly on hers as they both surrendered to the deep and silent tide of the night where the beauty and the fire were finally one. The final chapter of their story began when the first snow of the high mountains started to fall, turning the obsidian peaks into jagged teeth of white marble, and the world outside the tower became a soft blur of falling flakes. Inside the chamber, the blue flames had turned to a deep and steady amber as Valerius brought a final offering to the princess, a crown made not of gold but of woven mountain briars and silver thread. He placed it upon her head with hands that no longer trembled with the heat of a hunter but moved with the slow reverence of a man who had finally found his peace. He told her that the kingdom of shadows was now hers to rule, and that his cruelty had been fully tamed by the very radiance he had tried to cage. Princess Alara stood on the balcony as the cold wind whipped her hair into a frenzy of silk. But she felt no chill, because the fire of the prince's devotion had become a cloak that moved with her every breath. She looked down at the vast valley below and realized that the ivory palace of her father was a ghost of a previous life, a place of shallow light that could never compare to the profound depth of the darkness she now shared with the mental pain of being alone in a crowd had vanished, replaced by the heavy comforting reality of being everything to one person. The prince stepped up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder as they watched the snow bury the paths that led back to the world of men. They were no longer a princess and a prince, but two forces of nature that had collided and found a perfect equilibrium in the silence of the storm. The cruelty of the Ashik prince had become a fierce protection, and the beauty of the princess had become a guiding light that gave the shadows a reason to exist. As the moon reached its highest point, and the sky turned a shade of indigo so deep it was almost black, they stepped back into the warmth of the room and closed the heavy oak doors for the final time. The world could keep its wars and its kings and its fleeting suns, for they had found a kingdom that would never change, and a love that required no words to sustain it. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn shut, and the amber flames flickered out, leaving only the scent of pine and the warmth of shared breath in the quiet air. Elara laid her head upon the princess' chest, and the steady thrum of his heart became the only lullaby she would ever need to hear. The exhaustion of their journey and the weight of their destiny pulled them down into a sleep that was absolute and eternal. A state where the soul is finally at rest and the heart is finally full. The story of the beauty and the cruel Ashik prince was written into the stone of the mountain. And as the snow continued to fall, it covered the castle in a blanket of silence that would remain undisturbed for 1,000 years. The story reached its final rest as the snow completely covered the obsidian castle until it became one with the mountain itself, and the echoes of the world below finally ceased to exist. In the deep silence of that high tower, the Princess of Beauty and her cruel Ashik prince were no longer two separate people, but a single legend woven into the fabric of the night. Every window was sealed by the frost, and every door was guarded by the heavy mountain air, ensuring that the peace they had found would never be broken by the hands of time. Their love had become the very breath of the peaks, a cold and beautiful power that kept the stars aligned and the valleys quiet in the dark. As the last embers of the fire turned to gray ash, the room was filled with a soft and infinite shadow that felt like a warm embrace from the universe. There were no more words to be spoken and no more paths to be traveled, because they had reached the end of all longing and the beginning of a dream that would last forever. The ivory and the obsidian had merged into a perfect shade of twilight, where the heart is always still and the mind is always calm. You can feel the weight of that silence now settling over your own room like a blanket of fallen snow as the story fades into the mist and the journey concludes in the heart of the deepest rest. Sleep now, for the prince and the princess are watching over the night, and the world is finally at peace. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your night. May you find deep peace and restful sleep. Wishing you the sweetest dreams. If you liked it, please like, comment, and subscribe. Bye.